Let's speak to Bella Sankey, who is the Deputy Director of Reprieve. That's a charity which has worked on a number of rendition cases. Baroness Chakrabarti is Labour's Shadow Attorney General and former Director of the campaign group Liberty. And to Moazzam Begg, who himself was once held at Guantanamo Bay. Moazzam Begg, how do you react to some of the conclusions in this report?
Well, I had the pleasure of meeting Dominic Grieve last year and speaking to him with other former Guantanamo prisoners, explaining to them that we felt that the scope of the inquiry still wasn't adequate because it wasn't adequately independent, and I don't think we had the powers to follow through on things that I think are very crucial to this, and that is that if people have been recognised as involved in our mistreatment and our torture, then what will happen next? In the case of Bilhaj, of course, we know we've had an apology, but there are British citizens like myself who were physically tortured, physically abused in the presence of or in the knowledge of our own agents from Britain, and still we don't know what will be the process of accountability. Will they say sorry? Will they say sorry, we can't tell you who these individuals are or how exactly what it is that they've done? What I remember very, very clearly at every single leg of the journey that I was held at, whether it was in Pakistan, whether it was in Bagram, Kandahar or Guantanamo, British intelligence agents were physically there watching as I was hooded, shackled, with a gun pointed to my head, threatened with being sent to Syria or Egypt if I didn't cooperate. The sounds of a woman screaming in the room next door that I was led to believe was my wife being tortured. British intelligence agents knew all about this.
Right, and as a result, my understanding is you have received a large amount of compensation. Is that not an acknowledgement?
No, it's not. That only happened because we went to court, and in 2010 we came to a settlement, and that settlement only was reached after the government was forced to disclose documents which showed clearly that they had been involved in our torture. There was simultaneously, we met with Kenneth Clark at the time, and we were told that an inquiry would take place, and only at the inquiry would any sort of apology take place.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me bring in Baroness Chakrabarti. How do you react to the fact that this country, in fact, the last Labour government, tolerated inexcusable treatment of detainees by the US?
Well, it's clearly horrifying. And I want to congratulate Dominic Grieve and his committee on doing the very best that they could with the limitations, the inevitable limitations on a parliamentary committee that answers to number 10.
Why do you think that the Labour government did tolerate it?
I think that it's pretty clear that in the days, months and years after 9/11, there was an understandable febrile atmosphere, and the senior partner in the special relationship, i.e. the United States, was dabbling in these most horrific practices, and to some extent the UK government went along for the ride, and that's been clear in the past, and it's clear again in one of today's two tandem reports. But what's perhaps even more concerning are the damning criticisms that Mr. Grieve's committee makes about the current situation. It points to a lack of clarity even today about what ministers can and cannot authorise. The committee found that ministers have different understandings of what they can and cannot authorise today, and a complete lack of clarity about this practice of rendition and to what extent it is still tolerated today.
Right, Bella Sankey, is it still going on?
The US has a rendition policy that is very much alive and well and active. The UK, it turns out, according to one of today's reports, doesn't have a policy on rendition. So this is almost 2 decades after we discovered that our closest partner had an institutional practice of doing this and rendering people to places of torture with our involvement. This government, previous governments have still not got their act together and given intelligence officers the desperate guidance that they need.
And how do you respond to the fact that in 198 cases British intelligence accepted information from detainees who they should have suspected or would have known had been tortured, and in 232 cases UK personnel continued to supply questions or intelligence to allies after they knew or suspected mistreatment?
It's absolutely appalling, and I think one of the important points that Dominic Grieve and his committee make in their reports is that while in the past I think heads of these agencies have tried to kind of spin this narrative that these were isolated cases, we couldn't have built up a picture here. He says in 2002 you had enough evidence from these isolated incidents to know full well that this was an institutional practice that the US was engaged in, and you should have taken action then to give our intelligence officers guidance and clear red lines about what they should and they shouldn't do. And that didn't happen then. It still hasn't even happened to this day.
Moazzam Begg, what do you want now? You talked about accountability. What does that mean in practical terms?
In all honesty, I want to see how far this goes. I remember that Jack Straw was saying that unless we all start believing in conspiracy theories, then there's no evidence at all that Britain was involved in any of the rendition programs.
And he was the Foreign Secretary in the last Labour government.
That's right. Yeah. So he's on record of having said that this was all conspiracy theories. Now I'd like people like him to answer those conspiracy theories, and also with Tony Blair, who was in power at the time. He still essentially got away with knowing what was taking place on his watch, or ought to have known what took place. And let's not forget, torture in the context of war is a war crime, and it's so serious that still I think that ultimately nobody, when I say accountability, will anybody be prosecuted for these war crimes? If anybody else had done them, would they have been subjected to the law the way that...
But are you saying people like Tony Blair and Jack Straw should be prosecuted for accepting information from alleged war crimes, i.e. people being tortured?
Essentially, if you're complicit in a crime, then you have to bear that responsibility. It doesn't mean, if you didn't pull the trigger, it doesn't mean that you weren't involved in some way or the other. I mean,
so you're talking about putting them on trial at The Hague?
Yes, essentially yes, because I want to make this absolutely crystal clear. I wouldn't have gone to Guantanamo or Bagram or been tortured had it not been for the British intelligence services. I've got complete evidence of that. The same individuals who came to my house in 1998 were the same ones who turned up then in Bagram, in Kandahar and in Guantanamo, the same individuals. And I described these individuals to the Metropolitan Police in fine detail. Okay. So it is important people understand this. That isn't just the ordinary officers who are involved, it goes right to the top.
Baroness Chakrabarti, you want a judge-led public inquiry. Why do you need that? No, hang on. Why do you need that when people like Moazzam Begg, who was subject to this horrific treatment, are saying, actually, let's use the War Crimes Tribunal at The Hague. That is the appropriate place.
Well, I think we need a judge-led inquiry, because Dominic Grieve himself in his report says that he was denied access to a number of individuals. And of course, a judge-led inquiry would have the powers to call individuals in this country who worked for the agencies at the time. I also think we need in this inquiry to review the operations of the secret courts legislation, the Justice and Security Act that was passed in 2013, that allows too much of this to be dealt with behind closed doors.
Okay. Thank you all very much. Thanks for coming on the programme. Moazzam Begg, who was detained at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, Baroness Chakrabarti, Labour's Shadow Attorney General, and Bella Sankey, Deputy Director of Reprieve, which is a charity which has worked on a number of these kind of cases.